All right, hi, this is Jack Yates again, graduate student, Master's of Science in Marketing at DU. And this is my first video, I guess, from the final full day of South by Southwest, March 9th. And the event that I want to talk about is called Psychedelics in the 21st Century and How to Use Them. This was a really interesting event. It was hosted by Zach Leary, who's the son of Timothy Leary, who's kind of a big deal in this world. He started the whole thing out with a plug for his new book, which I don't love, but he kind of made a joke of it later, so I guess that was fine. And he acknowledged that he is sort of, how he put it, a lineage holder, given who his father was. And I'm not going to spend too much time explaining who Timothy Leary is, but, Google him. And it was a really interesting talk because he kind of began with this timeline of the use of psychedelics, first saying that they're not new, they've been around for centuries. He talked a little bit about the stoned ape theory from Terence McKenna, which I've heard before. And if you haven't heard, it's basically that like human frontal lobe evolution was a result of taking psychedelics, and that the neural activation that came with taking the drug helped fuel our cranial evolution. While it's just a theory, he said that it was a sound assumption. There's no real way to prove this. And he sort of, again, this is all within the context of giving a timeline, and then he moved on to say, like, in ancient times, broad word, psychedelics were a healing tool connected to theology, and a shaman that would administer them is basically a doctor. And that, this sort of thousands of year use of the drugs ended abruptly with European contact, specifically colonialization in a Puritan context. And there's a quote I wrote that way: it stripped away anything that did not fit into the view of spiritual practice in the Western world. So things like psychedelics were viewed as like demon-like. And then he had another funny, well, it's not funny, but another quote that I wrote down that, like, within this transition, the motto was kind of convert or die. So that drove a lot of the psychedelic use as a spiritual tool underground, until some people in the early 20th century started to explore them again. He mentioned David Thoreau, who doesn't talk about psychedelics, but primarily how his writing and this idea of like looking inward to find satisfaction like spawned ideas for people to go out and look for psychedelics. He talked about Aldous Huxley and his book The Doors of Perception, which was published in 1954, which is the first Western mainstream account of psychedelic use. And then he spoke about someone that excuse me, sorry, was mentioned in some other talks of mine, this guy Gordon Wasson, who went to do a mushroom ceremony in Mexico and wrote about it for Life magazine. And this is all happening in the 50s. These are all this Gordon Wasson, Aldous Huxley, and this Albert Hoffman creating LSD in 1943. All happened in the 50s. And then the 60s come and they like explode everything. This is when Timothy Leary comes along, the father of the presenter, and he started talking about Ram Dass a little bit. And this is where he actually brought up some interesting points, because he said that the 60s was both a good and a bad thing for psychedelics. Like, it leaked out of the lab, is how he put it, and with that came like widespread use. There was a statistic that he had that between 1967 and 1969, 700,000 people under the age of 30 used LSD every single weekend. I mean, that's a lot of firepower. And he said one of the things that the 60s got right is it helped to expand beliefs that these drugs were actually beneficial and not dangerous. But it also got a lot of things wrong in the 60s. And expanding beliefs and use is important, but it also didn't do anything to talk about harm reduction, integration, combat disinformation. I mean, like, the mainstream viewed like the hippie movement, who were like the prime components of these pro-psychedelic use, as, well, let's just say negatively, and that like really hurt the PR of these drugs. And then he said because of that, and because of, again, that they leaked out of this lab setting, they weren't really able to get any data or clinical trials or study the drugs in the way they would have liked to, which would have taken years, but the stuff was quickly made illegal once the counterculture picked it up. And so, like, it was good, but there was also a really bad aspect of the 60s for psychedelics use. And that after the 1960s, psychedelic research went dark. You know, he mentions Nixon and Reagan and the war on drugs, and it's just sort of the end. So that was his overarching timeline. And then after that, Zachary Leary talked about how right now we are living in a psychedelic rebirth, that modern day in the 21st century in 2025, we're like, for the first time in history, well, I shouldn't say history, like the past century or so, really studying this stuff, really studying these drugs. He wasn't the first person that told me this either the whole time I've been at South by Southwest, but that, you know, we have data now, and it's endless. Like, we have so many studies. And that psychedelics for the first time are really starting to get not only linked to the mental health industry, which sort of relates to some other talks we went to as well, but they're getting like proven, reinforceable, quantitative and qualitative data that these drugs are helping people. There's even a quote that I wrote down from Zach that says, "I don't know how much more data we can create on the medical effectiveness of psychedelics." Like, that is to say that there's so much that exists that, like, we can keep running tests, but at this point, like, it's almost redundant. He shared that MDMA as a treatment for PTSD has a 70% success rate, which this, in context of the recent congressional hearings where MDMA was almost legalized for medical use and failed, was like really disappointing. But he also said that there's some dangers with the current use, with the current like potential legalization of psychedelics, and like this is where it's sort of, he does sort of what he did with the 60s. He sort of presents some benefits that says, like, now we have the data, now we have the science. There's retreats, especially in places like Oregon, that are helping people. But that there's also, in the United States, particularly, like, this big pharma thing. And that he said the medicalized movement for psychedelics also reeks of control and capitalism. That these things are, like, also, aside from being just a medicine, they're also a spiritual thing. They're also a meditative thing. They're also a therapeutic thing. And that he said, quote, "I am pathologically anti-authoritarian." He was quoting Jerry Garcia when he said that, which I thought was kind of funny. But he did say that, like, one of the good things that's happening now is psychedelics are no longer us versus them. He once led a retreat, I think he said it was in Colorado, actually, where he had an active duty SWAT officer on his retreat, like, not the kind of person that would traditionally be going on a psychedelic retreat. And he says some of the cons of modern medicalization are high costs. You know, it can be up to $12,000 for an MDMA session, which gets it into elitism. And there's a huge void of mystical exploration and encouragement that goes away by treating this stuff as, like, just pure medicine. Again, he talked about big pharma and profiteering, that, like, what happens if we take this spiritual thing and turn it just into a drug. I'm trying to keep an eye on my time. And that and he sort of left us with this open question. There's a lot more that he talked about, but I want to put in my thoughts. But he left with an open question of, like, would we create a more systemic control by legalizing psychedelics? And he's not sure. He's not really sure because we haven't done it. And he says about the effectiveness and that there has to be respect and equanimity. And he has a quote where he said, "If you're using psychedelics and you're still an asshole, did you get it at all?" So I'll put my notes away. But he brought up these really interesting points that I hadn't thought about it, because up until this talk, I'd been coming at it from a purely medical perspective of, like, these things help people. These things reconnect neurons. They help PTSD on a therapeutic level. They help CTE on a scientific neural level. But, like, when you do legalize big drugs like this, like, what's to stop people like Big Pharma just taking a hold of them and charging insane prices and making them, like, incredibly unavailable? I would counter some of the stuff he said by saying, like, with that, there's also safety. Like, you know what you're taking in some cases, especially in the age of fentanyl. You know, it's really dangerous to just be taking drugs on the street. And, like, you know, I don't really come at any of this from a recreations point of view. Again, I'm still sort of, like, pro that it should be medically available, because like even with the grossness of big pharma, it's still really helping people and therefore still really important.